My name is Clara Madison, and I am 39 years old, and I am sitting in the sunroom of the house that I fought to keep, the house that nearly became the casualty of the most devastating year of my life. The house where I grew my garden and raised my children and built the specific, ordinary, beautiful life that someone tried to take from me, using the oldest and most insidious weapon available to a person who wants to destroy another person without leaving visible marks, which is not a knife or a poison or anything physical at all, but something far more damaging and far more difficult to defend against, which is a story, a carefully constructed, patiently maintained, strategically delivered story told by one person about another person to the people who matter most. And the story that was told about me was that I was killing my husband, that the woman who cooked his meals and managed his household and raised his children and loved him for 14 years with the specific, unglamorous, daily devotion of a woman who has chosen someone completely and who has organized her entire life around that choosing was slowly and deliberately poisoning the man she loved. And the person who told this story was his mother, Vivian Harrington, who had spent 14 years looking at me across dinner tables and holiday gatherings and the ordinary intersections of a shared family life. And who had decided at some point, and for reasons that I have spent years trying to fully understand, that I was not the right woman for her son, and that the most efficient way to remove me from his life was not to ask him to leave me but to make him afraid of me. And she did this with a patience and a commitment and a specific, cold intelligence that I could not have anticipated because I had spent 14 years believing, or at least choosing to believe, that the woman across the table from me was complicated and difficult and sometimes unkind, but was ultimately someone who loved her son and who wanted, in her own managed and controlling way, for him to be happy. And what I understand now, what the events of the year I am about to describe taught me with the devastating clarity of a lesson learned at the highest possible cost, is that Vivian Harrington did not want her son to be happy. She wanted her son to be hers. And those two things are not the same thing. And the difference between them is the difference between a mother's love and a mother's possession. And possession, when it is threatened, does not negotiate or compromise or accept the reality of a grown man who has chosen a life that centers someone other than his mother. Possession fights. And the way Vivian Harrington fought was by telling everyone who would listen that I was poisoning her son. And by telling it so consistently and so specifically, and with such strategic deployment of detail, that my husband, Daniel Harrington, the man I had loved for 14 years, the man who had held my hand in delivery rooms and in dark theaters, and in the ordinary kitchen of our ordinary house on thousands of ordinary evenings, began to look at me across the dinner table, with something in his eyes that I had never seen there before and that I recognized with a cold and specific horror as doubt, the particular doubt of a person who is beginning to believe something terrible about someone they love. And I want to tell you this story from the very beginning, because the beginning is where everything that came after was made possible, and the beginning is not the hospital room, and it is not the doctor telling Vivienne to leave. It is much further back. It is 14 years back. It is the first time I met Vivian Harrington in the living room of her house in Charlottesville, Virginia, on a Sunday afternoon in October, when Daniel and I had been together for 4 months, and when I was 25 years old and entirely unprepared for what I was about to walk into, which was not just a mother's house but a mother's world, a world organized entirely around the specific geography of Vivienne's needs and Vivienne's preferences, and Vivienne's understanding of how things should be, a world in which Daniel was the son and everything else was arranged at whatever distance from him Vivienne had determined was appropriate, and I was about to discover, though I would not understand it fully for many years, that appropriate distance from Daniel, as determined by Vivienne, was a distance that no woman he loved would ever be close enough to satisfy her and far enough to satisfy me, because the appropriate distance was outside the orbit entirely, was the distance of someone who does not exist in the picture, and I, standing in her living room in my best dress, with the flowers I had brought as a hostess gift, and the smile that I had prepared on the drive from Richmond, where Daniel and I had been living for the 3 months since we had moved in together. I did not know any of this yet. I knew only that I was nervous and that I wanted to make a good impression, and that Daniel had told me his mother was particular, which is the word that people use for difficult. When they love the person who is difficult and do not want to say difficult out loud, because saying it out loud requires them to acknowledge something they have been carefully not acknowledging. And I accepted particular as the full description and walked into Vivian Harrington's living room and extended my hand and smiled and said I was so happy to finally meet her. And she looked at me with the expression that I would spend the next 14 years cataloging and never fully decoding. The expression that contained warmth on the surface and assessment underneath. Assessment so thorough and so rapid that by the time I had finished my sentence, she had already reached her conclusion, and the conclusion was that I was not what she had planned for her son, and that the appropriate response to something that is not what you planned is to manage it until it becomes what you planned, or until it goes away. And for 14 years, Vivian managed me, and when the managing did not produce the result she wanted, she escalated, slowly, patiently, with the specific strategic intelligence of a woman who understands that the most effective campaigns are the ones that are never recognizable as campaigns until they are over. And the campaign she ran against me in the 14th year of my marriage was the most sophisticated and the most devastating and the most nearly successful thing she ever did. And it nearly worked. And the fact that it did not work is the reason I am sitting in my sunroom on this particular morning telling you this story. And the reason it did not work is partly my own strength, and partly the specific, unexpected intervention of a physician named Dr. Marcus Webb, who walked into a hospital room on a Tuesday afternoon and heard the last 8 words of what Vivian was saying to my husband, and who looked at her and said, "Mrs. Harrington, I am going to have to ask you to wait outside," and who closed the door after her and looked at me and at Daniel and said, "Let me tell you what is actually causing your symptoms." And what he said, and in that room on that Tuesday afternoon, was the beginning of the end, of the most difficult year of my life, and the beginning of the rest of my life. And I want to take you there. I want to take you all the way there. But first I need to take you back. Back to the beginning of Daniel and me. Back to the beginning of Vivienne. Back to the beginning of everything that made that hospital room possible. Because this is a story that requires its full context to be understood, requires the 14 years before the hospital room to explain what happened in it. And I am going to give you every year of it, because every year matters, and because this story deserves to be told completely and honestly, and without the softening that I spent 14 years applying to it in the privacy of my own mind. The softening that said Vivienne was difficult but meant well, and that Daniel was caught in the middle, and that the situation was complicated, and that the complicated was something I could manage, if I was patient enough and generous enough, and willing enough to absorb what was done to me without naming it too directly or too loudly. And I am done with the softening. I have earned the right to tell this story in its full weight and its full truth and its full specific detail. And that is what I am going to do. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of Thomas and Helen Madison, who ran a hardware store on the east side of the city that Thomas's father had opened in 1962, and that Thomas had taken over when his father retired. And that was, for my entire childhood, the specific, reliable center of our family's life, the thing around which everything else was organized. The early mornings, and the long Saturdays, and the specific smell of metal and wood, and the dust of industry that my father carried home with him every evening, and that I associate, completely and without ambivalence, with safety, with the specific safety of a childhood in which the world was consistent, and the people in it were who they said they were, and the love available was proportional to the need for it, rather than being rationed according to some calculation that I was never given access to. My mother, Helen, was a woman of the specific, practical warmth of women who have been raised in families that express love through action rather than sentiment, who showed up for every school event, and who cooked dinner every night, and who helped me with homework at the kitchen table, and who told me I was capable of anything I decided to be capable of in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who is stating a fact rather than offering encouragement. And the effect of this matter-of-fact delivery of confidence was that I absorbed it as fact rather than as encouragement, and built my life on it accordingly. Which is to say, I built my life with the specific confidence of someone who was never told that confidence required justification, who was simply expected to have it, and who therefore had it in the unremarkable, structural way that people have things that have always been available to them. I had an older brother named Marcus and a younger sister named Sarah, and we were a family that was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary is actually extraordinary. The specific richness of a childhood without drama, without the particular textures that difficult circumstances provide, and that people sometimes mistake for depth, but that are actually just difficulty. And the absence of those textures in my childhood meant that when I encountered them in my adult life, I did not have, initially, the pattern recognition that would have helped me identify them earlier and respond to them more effectively. And this gap in my pattern recognitions is part of what made the years with Vivienne as costly as they were. Part of what allowed the campaign she ran against me to operate longer than it should have, before I understood it clearly enough to respond to it. I met Daniel in the second year of my graduate program at the University of Virginia, where I was studying clinical psychology and where Daniel was in the law school, and where we met at a party given by a mutual friend in an apartment in the corner area of Charlottesville that was too small for the number of people in it and too loud for conversation, and where Daniel and I had ended up on the fire escape together, not because either of us had planned to be on the fire escape, but because both of us had independently the party decides that the fire escape was preferable to the party, and had discovered each other there, standing in the October cold, with our drinks and the specific relief of people who have found the quiet place at the loud event. And we talked for 2 hours on that fire escape about the law, and about psychology, and about the intersection of the two, and about books, and about the city, and about where we had each come from, and where we each thought we were going. And by the time the party was ending, and people were coming out onto the fire escape to leave, I had the specific feeling that I have had only a few times in my life, the feeling that a conversation has been worth every moment of it, and that the person I have been having it with is someone I want to keep having conversations with. And Daniel had the same feeling, or said he did, or demonstrated it by asking for my number in the specific direct way that men ask for numbers when they are genuinely interested rather than performing interest. And I gave it to him, and he called the next day, and we had dinner the following Friday, and the dinner lasted 4 hours. And by the end of it, we both understood that something had started that was going to require us to pay attention. He was from Charlottesville originally, which is where his mother still lived, which is where his entire family infrastructure was located, which is where the roots of his life were planted in ways that were not going to be easily relocated. And I was from Richmond, which was close enough to be geographically manageable, but far enough to be a different world, in the specific ways that Virginia cities are different worlds from each other. And the distance between our origins was the first of several things that Vivienne would eventually use as evidence for her argument that I was not right for her son. Though she did not start with it, she started with subtler things, with things that were easier to dismiss as simple preference rather than strategic opposition. And the subtler things came first, because the subtler things are always first, because a sophisticated campaign starts with what can be denied and escalates only when denial is no longer sufficient. I want to tell you about Daniel, because understanding him is as important as understanding Vivienne for making sense of what happened. And what I want to tell you is this. Daniel was a good man who was also a man who had grown up inside his mother's orbit in ways that had made the orbit normal to him, had made the specific gravity of Vivienne's personality the gravitational field within which he understood himself, so that her approval was not something he consciously sought, but something his body oriented toward the way a plant orients toward light, automatically and without decision. And the consequences of this orientation were things that I saw clearly from the outside, and that Daniel could not see at all from the inside. Consequences that expressed themselves in 100 small ways across the 14 years of our marriage. In the way that he softened his defenses when Vivienne was in the room. In the way that conversations about his mother had a quality of careful management that conversations about everything else did not have. In the way that her criticism of me was received as information worth considering rather than as the motivated campaign that it actually was, and the receiving of it as information was not a failure of love or of character but a failure of pattern recognition, of the same kind that I had had in my own childhood. The specific failure that comes from being inside something so completely that you cannot see its shape from where you are standing. Vivienne Harrington had been a beautiful woman in her youth, and was a striking woman in her 60s, tall and fine-featured, with the specific bearing of someone who has always known that they are being watched and who has organized their presentation accordingly. And she wore her intelligence the way she wore her clothes, with the specific, deliberate attention of someone who understands that presentation is a form of power and who has never been willing to cede that power to the randomness of an unstudied appearance. She had been married to Robert Harrington for 32 years before he died of a cardiac event when Daniel was 26. And the death of Robert had done something to Vivienne that I understood but never fully articulated, because articulating it would have required me to say something about her that was both true and unkind, which is that Robert's death had collapsed the structure around which Vivienne had organized her need for control, had removed the primary object of her management. And in the absence of that object, she had redirected toward Daniel with an intensity that Robert's presence had previously tempered. And the redirection was complete and consuming and organized around the specific need of a woman who has been the center of a marriage and who is now the center of nothing, and who cannot tolerate the nothingness, and who finds, in the management of her son's life, the same sense of purpose and centrality that the marriage had provided. Daniel told me about his mother the way people tell you about difficult family members when they love them, which is with the specific combination of honesty and protection that produces a portrait that is accurate in its details and incomplete in its totality. That tells you the individual facts, without conveying the cumulative weight of them, so that you walk into the situation informed but not prepared, which is exactly the situation I walked into on that Sunday in October, when I stood in Vivienne's living room with my flowers and my smile and my entirely insufficient preparation for what the next 14 years were going to require of me. The first year of our relationship was the year of the surface. The year in which Vivienne maintained the performance of welcome while conducting the assessment that would determine the strategy of everything that followed. And I was performing for the assessment without knowing I was performing, which is the most exhausting kind of performance because you have no way to judge whether it is working because you do not know it is being judged. And looking back at that year, I can see the assessment in every interaction, can see the questions that were designed to produce information, can see the praise that was designed to establish a standard I would eventually fail to meet, can see the warmth that was designed to create a false sense of acceptance that could be withdrawn at the strategically optimal moment. But I could not see any of this at the time because I was 25 and in love and operating in good faith in a context that was not operating in good faith. And the gap between those two operating modes is the gap that Vivienne exploited for 14 years. Daniel and I were married in the second year of our relationship, in a ceremony that Vivienne helped plan in the specific way that difficult mothers-in-law help plan weddings, which is to say that she made suggestions that were instructions and that any deviation from those instructions was met with the specific combination of hurt feelings and practical objections that makes deviation feel more costly than compliance. And I complied more than I should have and less than she wanted. And the wedding was beautiful, and Vivienne wore a dress that was almost the same color as mine, which I noticed and others noticed, and nobody said anything about because some things are too specifically targeted to be acknowledged, without causing the kind of confrontation that a wedding day cannot accommodate. And I filed the dress color away in the part of my mind that was already, even then, beginning to catalog things that did not add up, that were individually small and collectively meaningful in a way I was not yet ready to name. We moved to Richmond after the wedding because my clinical psychology internship was in Richmond, and because Daniel had been offered a position at a firm there that was better than anything available in Charlottesville. And the move was the right decision professionally and personally, and was, I would later understand, the first decision of our marriage that Vivienne experienced as a direct threat to the orbit she had been maintaining. And the move from Charlottesville to Richmond was the moment at which the surface management began to deepen into something more organized. Something that was still deniable as simple, maternal concern, but that had the specific quality of escalation, of a woman who has assessed a situation and determined that the gentle approach requires supplementation. We were in Richmond for 3 years before Daniel's firm opened an office in Charlottesville, and Daniel was asked to lead it. And Vivienne had been in Charlottesville the entire time. calling Daniel every day with the specific regularity of someone who is maintaining a connection that might otherwise weaken with distance, visiting every 6 weeks with the specific frequency of someone who is conducting regular inspections, rather than enjoying spontaneous family time. And the calls and the visits were each individually unremarkable, and collectively, the architecture of an influence that never allowed Richmond to become fully our place, rather than a temporary station between one phase of our lives in Charlottesville and the next. And when the offer to return to Charlottesville came, Vivienne presented it to Daniel not as an opportunity to be evaluated, but as an obvious choice to be made. And Daniel evaluated it and decided it was a good opportunity. And I agreed because the professional ill case was strong, and because I had by then established my own private practice in clinical psychology that I could relocate. And we moved to Charlottesville when we had been married for 3 years. And our daughter Sophie was 18 months old. And the move back to Charlottesville was the moment at which Vivienne's strategy shifted from maintenance to expansion, because proximity gave her access that distance had been limiting. And she used that access with the specific, patient thoroughness of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity and who is not going to waste it. Sophie was 3 when our son James was born, and the years of the children's early childhood were the years that I now understand as the years of accumulation, the years in which Vivienne's campaign added detail and texture and the specific weight of many small things that were each dismissible individually and collectively significant. The years of comments at family dinners about the way I was feeding the children and the way I was disciplining them and the choices I was making, about their schooling and their activities and their social lives. Comments that were always framed as questions or observations, or the sharing of experience rather than as criticisms. Comments that Daniel received as his mother's way of being involved, and that I received as the ongoing assessment of a woman who was building a case, collecting evidence for a position she had not yet announced, but that she was documenting with the patience of someone who understood that the best cases are made over time, rather than in a single dramatic moment. I want to tell you about a specific evening in the 7th year of our marriage, because it is the evening that something shifted between Vivienne and me in a way that I felt clearly, even though I could not fully articulate it. The evening at which the campaign moved from the subtle to the slightly less subtle. The evening that I now understand as the beginning of the escalation that would eventually produce the hospital room, and the doctor and the door closing on Vivienne's face. We were at Vivienne's house for Sunday dinner, which was a regular occurrence every other Sunday, the rhythm of it established in the first years of our marriage as a family tradition, and maintained with the specific regularity that Vivienne required of everything she organized. And the children were 7 years old in Sophie's case, and 4 in James's case, and they were at the table with the specific contained energy of children who have been told to behave at grandmother's house and who are managing the containment with varying degrees of success. And Daniel was talking to his mother about something at work, some case detail that she was asking about with the specific interested attention she gave to Daniel's professional life. And I was in the kitchen helping Vivienne's housekeeper clear the first course. And when I came back to the table, Vivienne was saying something to Daniel in a voice that was low enough that I could not hear it from the kitchen doorway, but that stopped when I entered the room, stopped with the specific, abrupt stop of a conversation that does not want to be overheard. And Daniel looked at me when I came in, and his face had the expression of a man who has just heard something that he is processing. And Vivienne smiled at me with the surface warmth that I had been seeing for 7 years and said, "Clara, there you are." And the conversation resumed on a different topic, and I served the children and sat down, and the evening continued, and nothing was said about what had been said. And I did not ask because asking would have produced a denial and a counter-accusation of paranoia that I was not yet equipped to respond to. But I noted it. I noted the stopping of the conversation and Daniel's expression and the specific quality of Vivienne's smile when I came back into the room. And I added it to the catalog I had been keeping since the wedding dress, the catalog that was growing in ways that I found unsettling, without yet being able to articulate clearly what the catalog was documenting. The health issues began in the 9th year of our marriage. Daniel started having symptoms that were vague, and then specific, and then alarming, the kind of symptom progression that begins with fatigue and becomes something more organized. And we went through the process that symptoms require, the primary care physician, and the referrals and the tests, and the waiting for results that is itself a form of illness. The anxiety of not knowing producing its own physical effects that complicate the picture further. And through this process, Vivienne was present in the way that she was present. For everything significant in Daniel's life, which is to say, constantly, and with the specific intensity of someone who believes that their presence is both necessary and welcome, and who does not distinguish between those two things carefully enough to understand that the necessity is something she has constructed, rather than something that actually exists. The tests came back. The specific results are not something I am going to share in full detail, because they are medical and private, and because what matters for this story is not the specific diagnosis, but the specific context in which the diagnosis was received and the specific way that Vivienne used that context to begin the most damaging phase of her campaign against me. And what the diagnosis revealed was that Daniel had a condition affecting his liver function that was serious enough to require significant medical intervention, and that had been developing over a period of several years, and that the gastroenterologist, a careful and thorough man named Dr. Chen, explained in language that was clear and specific, and that covered the potential causes with the completeness that good medicine requires. And among the potential causes that Dr. Chen mentioned as one item in a list of several, mentioned in the way that a responsible physician mentions all relevant possibilities without implying probability for any specific one, was environmental exposure, which in the context of liver function issues includes exposure to certain substances that could be introduced through food or drink or other environmental contact. Vivienne was at the appointment. Daniel had asked her to come, which he had not discussed with me in advance. And I had arrived at the gastroenterologist's office to find her already in the waiting room with Daniel, already positioned as part of the medical support team in a way that I found surprising, and that I did not comment on because commenting on it would have seemed small in the context of Daniel's health concern, and because I had spent 9 years not commenting on the things that Vivienne did that I found surprising, and the habit of own kind of silence that I was living inside, without fully recognizing it. As a choice, Dr. Chen mentioned environmental exposure. I watched Vivienne receive this information. I watched her file it. I watched her face do the thing that faces do when a person has received information that they intend to use. The specific, brief quality of attention that precedes the return to the neutral surface expression. And I felt the cold, specific recognition of a woman who has been keeping a catalog for 9 years and who has just understood that the catalog is about to become relevant in a way she had not anticipated. Over the following weeks, as Daniel underwent additional testing, and as the medical team worked toward a clearer understanding of his condition and its causes, Vivienne began a series of conversations with Daniel that I was not part of, conversations that I know about, because Daniel told me about them with the specific, uncomfortable quality of a man who is not sure whether he is sharing information or delivering a message, and who is navigating the discomfort of being between two people who matter to him in ways that require him to manage the navigation carefully. And what he told me was that his mother was worried, that she had been doing research, that she had questions, and the questions were about my cooking, about what I was using in the kitchen, about where I was buying things and what I was putting in his food. And when Daniel told me about these questions, he told me about them with the specific, apologetic framing of a man who is relaying something he knows is unfair, but who has not yet decided what to do about the unfairness. And I looked at my husband, and I felt something that I cannot describe with a single word, but that was the combination of disbelief and recognition, and a very specific, very cold fear. The fear of a woman who understands that the campaign she has been watching build for 9 years has just reached a new phase, a phase that is more dangerous than anything that came before it because it is targeting not her relationship with her in-laws, or her social standing or her professional identity, but the most fundamental thing available to be targeted, which is her husband's physical safety, which is his life, which is the thing that every other person in the situation will prioritize above every other considerations, including fairness and evidence and the 14 years of a marriage that has been the organizing fact of two people's lives. I want to tell you about the next 6 months because they were the 6 months in which everything escalated and in which I had the specific, terrifying experience of watching a narrative being constructed about me that I could not fully rebut. Because the rebuttal required me to prove a negative, required me to demonstrate the absence of something rather than the presence of something, required me to show that I had not done something, rather than to show that I had done something else. And the proving of a negative is the specific, exhausting, nearly impossible task that false accusations always impose, the burden of evidence that shifts to the accused in the specific, unfair way that accusations of this kind always shift the burden. And I carried that burden for 6 months, while Daniel's health fluctuated, and while Vivienne's whisper campaign expanded from the conversations she was having with Daniel to the conversations she was having with other people, with the extended family members and the family friends and the social network of a woman who had been embedded in Charlottesville society for 30 years, and who knew how to move information through that network with the specific, untraceable efficiency of someone who understands how rumors work and how to give them momentum without appearing to be the source. She told people she was worried about Daniel. This was true. She told people she didn't understand what was causing his illness. This was also true. She told people she had questions about his diet, about what he was eating, about whether the right things were going into his food. This was the beginning of the untrue, the beginning of the framing that would produce in people who heard it the specific, uncomfortable suspicion that the framing was designed to produce. The suspicion that lives below the level of accusation and above the level of dismissal, the suspicion that says, I'm not saying anything specific, I'm just asking questions, I'm just concerned, I'm just a worried mother. And the concerned, worried mother framing is the most effective shield available to someone who is doing something that requires a shield. Because no one challenges a worried mother. No one tells a worried mother that her concern is malicious. No one looks at the tears of a woman who is afraid for her child and says those tears are a strategy, even when they are, even when the strategy is the most important thing happening in the room, and the tears are the window dressing. Daniel started to change. I want to tell you about this carefully because the change was the most frightening thing that happened in the year before the hospital room, and because describing it accurately requires me to be precise about something that is both observable and also deeply personal, deeply painful, deeply the kind of thing that a woman remembers with a specific interior ache that has nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the specific grief of watching someone you love look at you differently. The grief of seeing in the eyes of your husband a new quality that was not there before, and that you know has been put there by someone else, someone who had access to him in the hours and the spaces that you did not share, someone who was working those hours and spaces with the patient, sustained intelligence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and who had been planning escalation for years before the opportunity to execute it presented itself. He became quieter at meals. Not the comfortable quiet of a man who is at ease, the specific, slightly watchful quiet of a man who is paying attention to something he has been told to pay attention to, who is observing rather than simply being. And I felt the observation the way you feel a change in temperature. The specific awareness that the air in the room has shifted, that something that was a certain way is now a different way, and I did not know how to address it, because addressing it required naming something that was not yet fully formed. Required saying, I think your mother has told you to watch me while we eat, and I don't know how to say that without sounding like the paranoid woman she is working to make you believe I am. He asked me once, with the specific care of a man who has been coached on how to ask something without it seeming like the accusation it actually is, whether I had changed anything about how I was cooking his food, whether I was using different oils or different seasonings, or anything new that might be affecting the way things tasted. And I looked at him, and I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, and I said no, nothing had changed. And he nodded and said, okay, and we continued eating. And the floor slowly righted itself but never entirely returned to level, never went back to the specific solidity that it had had before the question. And I understood that the question was not Daniel's question, was Vivienne's question delivered through Daniel, and the delivery mechanism was the specific cruelty of it. The fact that the person asking me whether I was poisoning my husband, was the man I loved, was the person whose doubt was the most damaging thing available to be deployed against me. And Vivienne had deployed it through him rather than through herself, because having him ask was more devastating than having her ask, was the specific calculated escalation of a woman who understood that the wound would go deepest if it came from the direction of love rather than the direction of suspicion. I want to tell you about what I did during those 6 months because what I did matters for understanding what happened in the hospital room and what happened after it. And what I did was 3 things that I did simultaneously, and with the specific, disciplined focus of a woman who has understood that she is in a fight and that the fight requires her to be strategic rather than reactive, to be clear-eyed rather than emotional, to be building something rather than simply defending against something. The first thing I did was document. I am a clinical psychologist, and documentation is as fundamental to my professional practice as language is to a writer. The recording of what was observed and when and what it meant and what the pattern was, and I applied this professional skill to my personal situation, with the specific determination of someone who understands that the story being told about them requires a counter-narrative, and that counter-narratives require evidence, and I began keeping a detailed record of every interaction with Vivienne that was relevant, every comment made, and every conversation overheard, and everything Daniel reported that his mother had said, every date, and every specific word where I could remember it, every instance of the campaign that I could document with the precision that documentation requires. The second thing I did was talk to my own therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Moore, who I had seen intermittently throughout my adult life, and who I began seeing weekly during this period, not because I was falling apart, but because I understood that this was a situation in which maintaining my own clarity was the most important thing I could do, and that maintaining clarity under sustained attack requires support, requires the specific professional support of someone who can help you hold your own perception when the perception is being systematically challenged by the people around you. And Dr. Moore was extraordinary during this period, was the person who gave me language for what was happening when I could not find the language myself, was the person who said gaslighting when I described what was occurring without using that word. And having the word was important. Having the accurate name for the thing that was being done to me was part of what allowed me to resist the process of being gaslit, to maintain the specific, necessary belief that my perception of reality was accurate even when the people around me were working to convince me that it was not. The third thing I did was the most difficult and the most important, which was that I found a new physician for Daniel, a physician who had not been managing his care during the period when Vivienne had been establishing her presence in his medical team, a physician who would therefore have no prior relationship with her and no prior context for receiving her as a legitimate voice in the management of her son's health. And the new physician was Dr. Marcus Webb, who practiced at the University of Virginia Health System and who had a reputation in the gastroenterology community as someone whose diagnostic rigor was exceptional, and I found him through a referral from a colleague in my clinical psychology network who knew him professionally. And I suggested to Daniel that a second opinion from a specialist of Dr. Webb's caliber was appropriate given the complexity and the seriousness of his symptoms. And Daniel agreed, and the appointment with Dr. Webb was scheduled for a Tuesday in November. That would turn out to be the most important day of the year. Though I did not know this when I scheduled it, did not know that the appointment that I had arranged as a medical intervention would become the specific, unexpected turning point of the entire situation, would become the day on which everything changed because of a woman who could not help herself, who could not resist the opportunity to deliver her campaign even in a clinical setting, who walked into a hospital room and sat across from her son, and said the things she had been building toward for months, while the door was still open, and while the physician, who had just left to retrieve a file, was already on his way back through the hallway. I arrived at the hospital before Daniel and before Vivienne. I had driven separately because I had a client session in the morning and had come directly from my office, and I sat in the waiting area of the gastroenterology clinic with the specific, contained anxiety of someone who has been managing their anxiety for months and who has become very good at the management, even when the management is taking everything she has. And Daniel arrived 20 minutes later with Vivienne beside him, and I watched them walk through the door together, and I felt the specific, cold clarity that I had been feeling for months when I saw them together in this specific configuration. The configuration of a mother and son who were aligned in a way that the wife was not part of. The configuration that Vivian had been constructing, and that Daniel was inside without fully understanding its architecture. And I stood up, and I greeted them both, and I sat with them in the waiting area. And we talked about ordinary things in the specific, careful way of people who are all aware that something is happening beneath the surface of the conversation, and who are all performing ordinary conversation in order to not address it directly. And when Daniel's name was called, we went in together, all three of us, into the examination room where Dr. Webb's nurse took vital signs and noted the current symptom picture, and told us the doctor would be in shortly. And we sat in the room and waited, and Vivienne sat in the chair closest to Daniel's bed, and I sat in the chair on the other side, and the room had the specific atmosphere of a place where important things happen, and where the importance is contained in the architecture itself, the examination table and the equipment, and the diplomas on the wall, and the specific quality of fluorescent light that hospitals and clinics have. The light that makes everything slightly more real and slightly more stark than the same things would look in natural light. Dr. Webb came in and introduced himself with the specific, warm efficiency of a physician who is both personable and focused, who makes you feel seen and attended to, while also making it clear that the seeing and attending to is in service of a clinical purpose that requires his full professional attention. And he reviewed Daniel's history and asked questions and listened to the answers, with the specific quality of listening that good clinicians have. The listening that is also analyzing, that is building a picture from what is being said, and from what is not being said, and from the way things are being said. And Vivienne participated in the question and answer with the specific, confident engagement of a woman who has established herself as a legitimate voice in her son's medical care, and who is exercising that role with the fluency that comes from months of practice. And I participated with the specific, careful restraint of a woman who understands that the clinical setting requires a particular kind of behavior, and who is performing that behavior with every ounce of discipline she has available. Dr. Webb said he wanted to step out for a few minutes to review some prior records that his office had received from Dr. Chen, and that he would be back shortly, and he left the room. And the room became the room that it became, the room with the three of us in it, and the door partially open, and the hallway audible through the opening. And I was looking at the diplomas on the wall and counting my own breath, the way I had been counting my own breath for months, as a way of maintaining the specific internal steadiness that the external situation required. And Vivienne leaned forward in her chair, and she said to Daniel, in the voice that she used for the things she said to Daniel when she believed I was not fully attending, the voice that was lower than her normal voice and had a quality of urgency beneath the warmth, she said, "Daniel, I need to tell you something before the doctor comes back. I've been thinking about this for months, and I need you to hear it. I think Clara is putting something in your food. I think she has been doing it for a long time, and I think it's why you are sick, and I think you need to tell the doctor because the doctor needs to know." And then the door opened. Dr. Marcus Webb walked through the door of that examination room, having heard from the hallway the last portion of what Vivienne had said, having heard my name and the word food, and the word doctor, and the word no. And he assessed the room with the specific, rapid assessment of a physician who is walking into a dynamic that requires his attention. And he looked at Vivienne. And he said with the calm, specific authority of someone who does not raise their voice because raising their voice is unnecessary. When the authority is this clear and this complete, he said, "Mrs. Harrington, I am going to have to ask you to wait outside." Vivienne looked at him. She was not a woman who was accustomed to being asked to leave rooms, who was accustomed to being asked anything by anyone, because her social position and her specific quality of presence had always managed the rooms she was in rather than being managed by them. And the request from Dr. Webb was the first time in a very long time that someone in a position of authority had addressed her in a way that did not accommodate her preferred position. And she said, with the specific, controlled quality of a woman who is managing her response because the uncontrolled response would not serve her, she said, "I am Daniel's mother, and I have been part of his medical care." Dr. Webb said, "And I am his physician, and I am asking you to wait outside while I speak with my patient and his wife." There was a moment, a specific, waitful moment in which the room held the tension of two people with two different kinds of authority meeting in a space that only had room for one of them. And then Vivienne stood, And she looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked at his mother, and then looked at Dr. Webb, and then looked at me. And what happened in Daniel's face in that moment is something I have replayed many times, and that I understand now in ways I did not understand in the moment, which is that my husband was seeing something he had not been able to see before, was seeing his mother from a perspective that her constant management of his perspective had not previously allowed, was seeing her in a clinical setting being asked to leave by a physician of authority and responding to that request with the specific controlled resistance of a woman who does not leave rooms, and the seeing was producing in him the beginning of a recognition that would take months to complete. But that started in that moment, in the specific, important moment of watching his mother be asked to leave and choosing to let her be asked to leave without intervening. And Vivienne walked out of the room, and Dr. Webb closed the door, and the room became the room with the three of us in it. Daniel on the examination table and me in my chair and Dr. Webb standing with the file in his hand and the closed door behind him. He said, "I want to tell you what I heard when I came back into the room, and I want you to hear what I am about to say very carefully." He looked at Daniel and he looked at me and he said, "I have reviewed your file thoroughly. I have reviewed Dr. Chen's records and your test results, and the timeline of your symptoms, and the findings from every investigation that has been done. And I need to tell you that the picture is clear, and that the picture has an explanation that has nothing to do with anything you have been eating or anything your wife has done." He paused. He looked at Daniel. He said, "You have an autoimmune condition affecting your liver function. It is hereditary. It is something your body has been producing on its own, without any external contribution. And the evidence for this is in your genetic markers and in the progression of your symptoms, and in the specific pattern of your test results, which is entirely consistent with autoimmune hepatitis and entirely inconsistent with any form of external chemical exposure." He put the file on the counter. He said, "I don't know what you have been told or by whom, but I want to be very direct with you about what the medicine says. And what the medicine says is that your wife did not cause your illness. Your illness is genetic. It was inside you before you met her, and it would have developed regardless of what you ate or who prepared your food. And the treatment we are going to discuss today is a treatment for an autoimmune condition, not for any form of poisoning. Because there is no poisoning, there is an autoimmune condition, and the sooner we begin treating it correctly, the better your prognosis will be." The room was very quiet. Daniel sat on the examination table, and he looked at his hands, and he looked at me, and he looked at Dr. Webb, and he said very quietly, "How long have you known this?" Dr. Webb said, "From the moment I reviewed your records this morning. The pattern is unmistakable." Daniel said, "And my previous physician?" Dr. Webb said, "I can only speak to what I see in the records. What I can tell you is that the diagnosis is clear and has been available in your test results for some time." Another quiet. And then Daniel looked at me. He looked at me with the specific expression of a man who is understanding something he should have understood sooner, and who is sitting inside the weight of that understanding, and who does not yet know what to do with it. And what I saw in his face was not the doubt that had been there for months, the watching quality, the observation that had replaced the ease. What I saw was something different, something rawer and more fundamental. Something that was the beginning of the dismantling of the doubt, and the beginning of the reconstruction of the thing that the doubt had been eroding. And I held his gaze and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say in that moment that would have been more powerful than the silence. And Dr. Webb gave us the silence, the way good doctors give you the space for the thing that needs to happen between the medicine. And after a moment he said, "I'd like to discuss your treatment options." And we discussed them. Daniel and I with Dr. Webb, in the room with the closed door and the diplomas on the wall, and the specific quality of light that makes everything more stark and more real. And by the end of the appointment, we had a treatment plan and a follow-up schedule, and the beginning of a path forward that was organized around the correct understanding of Daniel's condition, rather than the manufactured narrative that had been organized around the wrong one. Vivienne was in the hallway when we came out. She was sitting in one of the chairs that line the walls of hospital corridors, sitting with the specific, composed quality of a woman who has been waiting, and who has been using the waiting to prepare, and she looked at Daniel when he came through the door, with the specific, expectant quality of a woman who is waiting for information that she believes will confirm what she has been saying, And Daniel looked at his mother and he said, "The doctor wants to see you." She stood. She said, "Why?" He said, "He has some things to explain to you." Vivienne went in and the door closed, and Daniel and I stood in the hallway, and I looked at my husband, and my husband looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. And then Daniel said, "Clara, I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "I should have told you months ago that she was saying these things to me. I should have told you, and I should have addressed it, and I didn't, and I am sorry." I looked at him. I said, "Why didn't you?" He said very quietly, "Because I was afraid." I said, "Of what?" He said, "Of the possibility that she was right." The honesty of this was the most difficult and the most important thing Daniel said to me in the year of this story. More difficult than the question about the cooking, and more important than anything that came after. Because the honesty was Daniel choosing truth over self-protection, at the moment when self-protection would have been easier. And I received the honesty the way I try to receive honest and difficult things, with the full weight of what it contained, and without the defensive retreat that would have made it smaller than it was. I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know that too." The door to the examination room opened and Vivienne came out, and her face had the specific quality of a woman who has just had a conversation that required her to hear things she did not want to hear, and who is managing the reception of those things with the full force of the composure that is her most consistent characteristic. And she looked at Daniel and she looked at me and she said, with a specific controlled quality that contained nothing that would look like what it was from the outside, "Dr. Webb is very thorough." Daniel said, "Yes," she said, "his explanation of your condition is very detailed." Daniel said, "It is." She said, "Clara," and she looked at me, and the look was the look that I had been cataloging for 14 years, the look that contained everything she was not saying in the specific arrangement of what she was saying. And I held the look and I said, "Vivienne." And I gave her nothing beyond her name. Nothing additional. No warmth and no hostility and no invitation and no door. Just her name. And she understood that the door was closed. And we walked out of the hospital together, the three of us. And we got into our separate cars and we drove home separately. And the year of the hospital was effectively over, though the work that the year had produced was only beginning. The months that followed were the months of reckoning and reconstruction, months that I want to describe with the same honesty and the same specificity that I have brought to the rest of this story. Because the months after the hospital room are as important as the months before it, are the months that determined what the whole thing meant, and what it would cost, and what it would produce. And I want to start with Daniel, because Daniel's reckoning was the most important, and the most difficult, and the one that required the most from both of us. He went to therapy. Not because I asked him to, but because he asked me for a recommendation, which he did the week after the hospital appointment, sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while the children were still asleep, sitting with his coffee and the specific quality of someone who has made a decision about something difficult, and who is ready to say it. And he said, "I want to see someone. I think I need to understand some things about my mother, and about myself, and about what happened this year, and I think I need professional help to do that." I gave him a name, a colleague in my clinical psychology network whose specialty was family systems and whose work I respected. And Daniel made the appointment and kept it. And he kept it every week for a year. And the work he did in that year of therapy is not mine to describe because it was his. Because what happens in therapy belongs to the person who does it. And the describing of it is their right, and not mine. But I will tell you what I observed from the outside, which was the specific, slow process of a man coming to understand the architecture of the family system he had grown up inside, the gravity of his mother's orbit, and the ways that gravity had shaped his navigation of everything else, including his marriage, including his response to the year of the hospital, and the understanding produced in Daniel, the specific, painful transformation that genuine understanding always produces when it requires you to see yourself clearly in ways that are not flattering. And Daniel went through that transformation with the specific, unglamorous courage of someone who has decided that the truth is worth the cost of seeing it. He also talked to Vivienne. This conversation happened 3 months after the hospital room, happened in her house in the specific setting that she had always controlled, and that he had now brought something into that she could not control, which was his own clear-eyed understanding of what had been done. And I was not part of that conversation. was not present for it. And what he told me about it afterward was limited in the way that children's conversations with parents always remain partly private. But what he told me was that he had told his mother, clearly and specifically, what he understood about what she had done and what it had cost, and what the conditions were for any future relationship between her and our family. And the conditions were non-negotiable. And the clarity was complete. And what Vivienne said in responses to the clarity and the conditions is something he did not share with me in full detail, and that I did not press him for because I understood that the conversation between a man and his mother about the specific failure of her love toward his wife is a conversation that belongs to both of them in ways that include privacy. And I trusted Daniel to have said what needed to be said, because the man I was watching in those months was not the man who had been watching me across the dinner table with doubt in his eyes, but the man I had fallen in love with at a party in Charlottesville. The man on the fire escape who had talked to me for 2 hours about the things that mattered, and that man was capable of saying what needed to be said. Vivienne's response to what was said was something I observed over the following year, in the same way that I had been observing her for 14 years, through the evidence of behavior, rather than the evidence of stated intention. And what the behavior demonstrated was a woman who had been required, for the first time in her relationship with her son, to absorb consequences for her actions rather than to manage away those consequences through the specific, patient application of her considerable social intelligence. And the absorption was not graceful, and it was not complete. And there were moments in the months that followed where the old patterns attempted to reassert themselves, where the managing voice and the strategic warmth and the placed comment would appear briefly before being addressed by Daniel now rather than absorbed by me, addressed with the specific, new clarity of a man who could see the pattern, because he had spent a year learning to see it. And the addressing produced, gradually, over many months, a different dynamic, not the relationship between Vivienne and me that either of us would have designed or chosen, but a relationship that was at least honest in its terms, that was organized around what was actually true, rather than around what Vivienne preferred to present as true. And honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, is always preferable to the alternative, because the alternative requires you to live inside of fiction, and fictions eventually collapse, as this one did, on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital room when a physician walked through a door. My children were 12 and 9 when the hospital year happened. Sophie and James were old enough to understand that something was happening in our family, and young enough to need the specific, managed protection of parents who are committed to not making them part of adult conflict. And Daniel and I were committed to this with a unanimity that was one of the things that survived the hospital year intact. The specific, shared understanding of two parents that their children's stability required their parents functioning as partners even when everything else was being renegotiated. And we functioned as partners in the management of the children's experience of that year, with the specific, exhausting competence of two people who are pouring everything they have into the one thing they both agree is non-negotiable. And Sophie and James came through the year with the specific resilience of children who were loved consistently and who were protected from the worst of what was happening around them. And what they understood in the aftermath of the year was shaped by Daniel and me, and by the conversations we chose to have and chose not to have, and by the example we set of two people who had been through something difficult and who were rebuilding something real on the other side of it. The treatment for Daniel's autoimmune condition was effective. Dr. Webb's protocol, begun in the weeks after the appointment, produced a measurable improvement in Daniel's liver function within 6 months, and a continued improvement over the following year. And the relief of watching Daniel's health stabilize and then improve was a relief that I cannot describe with adequate language. Because it was the relief of watching the person you love come back to themselves after a period of being diminished, of watching the color return to their face, and the energy return to their body, and the ease return to their presence, that illness takes away and that recovery gives back. And the giving back was something I witnessed every day, and that I was grateful for every day with the specific, full-body gratitude that people feel when a health crisis resolves into recovery rather than into something else. Daniel and I are still married. I want to say that because some people, knowing this story, have asked, and the answer is, yes, we are still married. Not because the year of the hospital did not cost us enormously. Not because the rebuilding was easy or quick or without its own specific difficulties, but because the cost was paid and the rebuilding was done. And what we built on the other side of it was something that was different from what we had before, and in certain ways, more real, more honest. Built on a foundation that had been tested rather than assumed. And the tested foundations has the specific quality of something you can actually stand on. Something you know will hold because it has been required to hold and has held, and that knowing is the specific, irreplaceable gift of the hard years, the gift that the easy years cannot give. Vivienne is part of our lives. Not the part she was before, and not the part she tried to make herself, but the part of a grandmother who sees her grandchildren on agreed-upon occasions, and who relates to her daughter-in-law with the specific, careful formality of a woman who understands that the terms are no longer hers to set, and who has accommodated this understanding with more grace than I expected, which is perhaps the surprise of the story's aftermath, that Vivienne at 72 is a somewhat different woman than Vivienne at 62. That the thing that happened in the hospital room and the conversation that followed it produced in her, slowly and without drama, and without any of the transformation that satisfying narratives require, a slight and genuine adjustment, the specific adjustment of someone who has encountered a limit and who has decided that the limit is real. And in my most generous moments, I think about Vivienne's love for Daniel, which is real, which has always been real, which is the engine of everything she did, including the things that were wrong. And I hold that love as the complicated, flawed, real thing that it is. The love of a woman who confused possession with devotion, and who spent 14 years trying to hold something that was not hers to hold. And I do not forgive her in the sense of erasing the cost, because the cost was real, and erasure would dishonor the people who paid it. But I hold the situation with the specific, practiced complexity of a woman who has spent her professional life helping other people hold complicated things, and who has learned that the complicated things are almost always more worth holding in their full complexity than they are worth flattening into the simpler version that anger or grief would prefer. I am Clara Madison Harrington, and I am 39 years old, and I am sitting in the sunroom of my house in Charlottesville, Virginia, on a morning that is the opposite of the year I have been describing, a morning that is clear and warm and full of the specific, ordinary beauty of a day that is simply and unreservedly itself. And the garden outside the sunroom windows is the garden I have been tending for 11 years, the specific, living evidence of patience and attention, and the willingness to plant things whose full beauty you will not see for years. And I am looking at the garden, and I am thinking about the year of the hospital, and about Dr. Webb, and about the door closing on Vivienne's face, about Daniel's expression when the doctor said what he said, and about the specific, unexpected gift of a crisis that clarifies rather than destroys, that removes the things that were not real and leaves the things that are, that requires you to stand inside the truth of your own life without the softening and the managing and the generous framing, and to see what is actually there. And what was there? What was always there beneath the campaign and the doubt and the fear and the year of watching eyes across the dinner table? What was there was my marriage and my children and the garden and the sunroom and the specific, unglamorous daily, irreplaceable beauty of a life that is genuinely and completely mine. And I am grateful for it with the full weight of someone who knows what it cost and who has decided every single day since that the cost was worth paying, and that the thing it bought is worth keeping, and that the keeping requires the same patient, daily attention that the garden requires, the same faith that what you plant with genuine intention and tend with regular care will grow into something worth having, something worth protecting, something worth telling the truth about, because the truth, even when it is this complicated and this costly and this specific in its particular weight, is always the only thing worth standing inside. This is my story. Every word of it is true, and I am still here, still tending, still growing. And the garden has never been more beautiful.